Hello and welcome to the Safety Goals podcast with Justin Torres and Charlie One, presented by Injure Free. This is episode 17 with our special guest, Stephanie Kuzydym. She graduated from Indiana University, and she's worked for multiple news outlets as a freelance writer, including the Washington Post. However, she now finds herself currently as a sports enterprise reporter at the Courier-Journal, where she has her project, Safer Sidelines. We're going to touch on this project a lot in today's episode, but just a quick rundown is that it is a project put in place to help prevent the unnecessary deaths of youth athletes. So, I know you guys are very intrigued to hear all about what Stephanie has to say. It's an amazing episode. So without further ado, let's get into the show. Okay, so we have Stephanie Kuzydym, and Stephanie is a journalist currently working for the Courier-Journal, covering her project known as the Safer Sidelines Project. Stephanie, it's a pleasure to have you on. I know last week we couldn't make the timing work, but still, better late than never, as they always say. And it truly is a pleasure to have on another journalist, especially a journalist from Indiana University. That's where my sister goes, where one of my best friends went. I've been there a couple times. It truly is one of the, cooler schools that's surrounded by nothingness, but still, you gotta love it. So thank you for taking the time and joining us.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. Indiana is, IU is like the prettiest campus. I think if you haven't been, you gotta just go see it. It's gorgeous.
Absolutely. I mean, Bloomington is such a nice city. It's a small town. You have a bunch of little shops. So truly the actual life of a student there is probably one of the best that you can get because you're just surrounded by the school.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, again, thank you for joining us. You've had a really, really, interesting career to start. You began working as a freelance writer. And ultimately, after that, you worked for the Washington Post, where you did freelance work, but now you're into the investigative reporting. So I'm wondering, could you maybe go and give us some background on what it is that you and your mission for the Safer Sidelines Project are and how they originated?
Sure, yeah. So, they originated a lot of different places. I can kind of pinpoint, I don't know, it kept popping up again and again in my career. The first time would be when I was actually at my senior year at Indiana University when I read a story about Max Gilpin, who died in Louisville from heat stroke. And I remember just thinking, like, this is crazy. Like, you hear about babies dying in cars and elderly dying from not having air conditioning, but, like, you don't hear about an athlete just, like, collapsing and dying. And at that point, Corey Stringer, I just don't think the two connected in my brain because one was a high school athlete and one was a college athlete. An NFL player. But the concept of an athlete dying kind of stuck with me because I was a sports reporter and you just, they tell you, like, find the stories nobody's covering. But that was just one that I'm like, I've really never really heard a whole lot about this. So that was kind of, my first iteration of it. And then my first year out of college, my mom called me and said, hey, there's a boy on the high school football team who collapsed and died. Do you know him? And I didn't. His name is Jake West. He collapsed of sudden cardiac arrest. They ended up finding out he had hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. And the closest AED was actually locked in the coach's office. And so I remember racing a triathlon that fall, and his mom talked about, like, the importance right before the race of, like, getting heart screenings and knowing, like, your heart health. And I remember thinking, like, I'm about to, like, compete in a sprint triathlon, which really pushes your heart rate, right? And I have no idea what's going on with my heart. I'm like, what am I doing? And also, like, if this is happening in my hometown and it happened with Max Gilpin and I read this story about it, like, I wonder if this is happening in other people's hometowns. So, I kind of put it down for a little while. I just was a high school sports reporter. I was a high school sports reporter out in Cleveland. And then I moved to Houston to cover just general assignments. And I covered a boy who was a baseball player who was hit in the heart by a line drive. And that was the first time I'd heard of commotio cordis. And Walker was the rare case. Doctors couldn't tell me how rare his case was that he actually suffered commotio cordis and then restarted his heart without any AD. They don't know how. But he's like 22 years old today. He's living a very successful life. Like, incredible story. But I just remember being drawn to healthcare of high school athletes and like the health and safety realm. And at the same time, Cody Stevens was a high school football player in Texas who had collapsed he had died at home of an undetected heart condition in his sleep. And I was sent to talk to his dad to talk about this bill that was trying to move through the legislature in Texas. And this was back in 2013. And like, what did it mean for athletes in the state of Texas if this bill did pass or if it did not pass? And so really, Houston, places before I had kind of gotten inklings and I'd gotten my feet into high school sports, but Houston was really the place where I started looking into like health and safety of athletes. And then it just kind of never left from there. I like to say that like the topic found me, I did not find it.
Sports are in full swing 24/7, which means athletes are bound to get injured. Injure-Free is a software platform used by youth sport organizations and schools that was developed to help coaches, parents, and administrators communicate injuries that occur and ensure a safe return to play. These sports safety networks are essential for sports teams working to provide the safest possible environment for their families. For more information or to schedule a demo, please visit www.injurefree.com. That's www.injurefree.com.
Well, I mean, for me, I also went to school for journalism. I went to ASU, and I knew for sure that sports is what I wanted to report on. So was it something with these stories that you heard that really drove you towards sports, or was sports always the destination when it came to journalism for you?
Sports was always the destination. So when I was in sixth grade, I said, like, I want to be a journalist. I want to tell stories. And I grew up in northern Indiana, so I was always watching the Cubs with my dad. And I said, like, I want to be a sports journalist who lives in Wrigleyville and covers the Cubs. And my dad was like, okay. And like, yeah, right. Journalism salary is never going to afford Wrigleyville. But sports journalism was always what I wanted to do. And I remember before Houston, I lived in Cleveland. I reported for the Cleveland Plain Dealer there and covering 180 high school athletic departments. I put like 5,000 miles on my car a month. It was so much fun and so crazy. I blinked and like my time there was over. But I remember sitting at my mentor's table, my journalism mentor, his name is Roy, and I didn't know anybody when I moved to Cleveland. So I moved in with Roy and his wife, Linda. And I remember sitting there over breakfast and being like, I'm so tired of the coach telling me this and me seeing that and which one's right? Like, not which one's right, but like, what do I report in this instance? Like, this is what I saw. And I'm asking, like, is this kid injured or is this or is that? And the coach is just not answering my questions. And so my mentor started telling me, like, there's documents and you could sit in a room with all these documents that would tell you things that you could report on the documents. And I remember being like, wait, what? That kind of journalism exists? And so it was in Cleveland before I went to Houston that I really started researching, learning about like the power of a document and what I could learn from them.
Yeah, and that kind of leads into my next question, because more or less, being a journalist of any kind requires some investigative reporting. But
Absolutely.
For me, when I would report on sports, my job was to go to a press conference or go to an event, capture the essence of what it's all about. But an investigative reporter has to do that, and then on top of that, dig even deeper to make sure that what they're reporting on really is what they're meant to be reporting on. So for that, is there an extra level that, a journalist needs to be an investigative reporter? Because it's not just the one step that all reporters have. There is, something extra to it.
Yeah, I think it's maybe not necessarily an extra level that you need. I think every journalist does investigative work at some point or another. You ask a question that digs a little bit deeper. I think the difference between me and a breaking news reporter is time. Time is a little bit more on my side. Pulling off Safer Sidelines took way more than turning around and writing a breaking news story from the standpoint of gathering all these documents, looking through all of them, the fact checking that we did, building the databases, all of the planning meetings that we had going into creating what you now see as Safer Sidelines. That's the big difference. But I mean, I got to where Safer Sidelines is because of all of the press conferences that I would go to and just hearing things and being like, wait a minute, but I want to know this. And like, so you said this, I wonder if there's a document for that, right? Like you said, it's not in your budget, but I see your football team with glitter in their helmets. So what is your budget? And where can I find that? And so I just started asking what probably lots of people would consider, like stupid questions, but I really didn't know. And I truly believe, and a state representative said this to me way back before I ever reported on Safer Sidelines when we had a project at another outlet that I was at when I was in TV. We did about 200 stories about the lack of healthcare on high school sidelines, and that project was called Athletes at Risk. And we were sitting down with a state representative who made a law following Max's death. And I said, why did you make this law? And she said, because people don't know what they don't know. And that has become my journalism motto. What do you not know that would help me inform you that you need to know, especially about athlete health and safety, which is something I don't know why we don't seem to report a whole lot on. What do I not know that I need to know? Where does the budget even exist? What does it look like? Who makes it? Is it a standard form document, which I found out in Kentucky? It is absolutely not. I got all kinds of things and I was like, oh, I don't know how to figure out what their budget, like what their expenditures are until I did, right? So I think the difference is I got more time to ask more questions on the exact same topic.
Got it. Well, I think that moving into Safer Sidelines, for sure, in the articles that I read, there are a ton of them, but some of the ones that I found the most interesting were the correlation between the need for ATs on the sideline and as you said, what you don't know. Seems like a lot of people just aren't aware of the actual benefits of having an AT, and you seem to be pushing that. Would you say that the improvement of having ATs at schools has been increased in the last couple of years, or do you think that it's still a very big fight to, get that conversation going?
I think it is still a massive fight to get that conversation going. I think there is a decrease in the supply. I do think that there is an increase in demand. But I do think that that increase has also increased more post DeMar, or that awareness of what they do. I will never forget the conversation I had in a Texas high school football stadium when I sat down with the quarterback's dad during a game on Friday night. And I said, I'm just wondering, do you know that your son doesn't have an athletic trainer? And he said, what are you talking about? I see that the athletic trainer's right there. I can see him. And I said, no, he has an athletic trainer for this game, but like, do you know he doesn't have one during practices during the week? He's like, no, that's his athletic trainer. And I said, that's this athletic trainer for this facility. Like the way they did it in Houston was like for a satellite, right? So like people might come play their games there. And he said, I had no idea. I just expect that he's there because I see him on Friday nights. And that's when I started realizing, like, yeah, you drop your kid off at sports. You're not sitting there all the time. Or what you see on game day, you just probably think is there all the time. And so parents don't even know that they should be asking some of these things. And that's why we did one of the pieces of Safer Sidelines is, 10 questions, and it doesn't have to stop at 10. That's for sure. We just wanted to keep it short, but questions that parents should ask, should feel empowered to be able to ask and know that they can ask their school districts about, including, does my school have an athletic trainer? If something happens to my child, who is the person that's going to respond? So.
And Stephanie, there's in the bigger picture too, what you're looking at on a deeper level is, you're touching on budgets, and you're looking at how are we making decisions, or how are districts and those sorts of folks making allocations and decisions around where the money goes. And ultimately, you would expect those decision makers to be informed on these topics and to have that layer of understanding but there's a gap, right? Because the information that you're describing now, or the awareness, the public awareness that you're describing now, is lacking. Parents don't know what they don't know. But we would expect that these administrators would have some understanding. And so there seems to be this gap in what we know, or what the general public is aware of. And in your discussions, what were some of the most, shocking or telling moments in your conversations where you identified that this gap exists? The story you just told was a great example, but were there other areas where you feel like the gold flakes and the football helmets, the decision prior to safety, was kind of a jaw drop moment for you as you went through this exploration?
I can't even name all the ones that absolutely. It happened more than I thought. Like, I thought maybe I had found a problem, but Safer Sidelines is truly a look at a broken system in which all actors in that system don't know a lot of what they don't know, right? Very starkly. Like, for instance, the state representative that I said about earlier, who basically now has my life motto, the law that she created says you have to create venue-specific emergency action plans for athletic venues in Kentucky. When I started requesting those plans, one of the bullet points in that law says it has to be posted conspicuously, but it has to be posted at venues. That means it's publicly posted. This was my second round of requesting them, because I had requested them the year before, and I still got from schools the second time around. The first year, I got 53 phone calls from athletic directors thinking I was a spam, not understanding what I was asking for, telling me I couldn't have that document. The second year goes around and I ask for the same document. I have still schools that say I'm not entitled to that document. That document isn't public, even though the law says it is. I have people thinking that what I want is their school emergency management plan, which is like, what do you do in a bomb threat? Which is exactly not what I want at all. Like, I want that to be private. It should be private. But what happens to a fan, a coach, a referee, like during the middle of a game? You want everybody to know how you should respond, or you want if you're just practicing, you want a kid to be able to read that. You want that to be posted because you don't know who it's going to be. And I had a board attorney call me and yell at me that this document that I was requesting wasn't public. And I just calmly sat there and listened to him. And at the end of it, I said, sir, I understand you don't think I'm entitled to this document, but here is the Kentucky revised statute for it. Please review it and then let me know if I'm not entitled to it. And an hour later, it was in my inbox, because they didn't even realize there was a law on the books. Because the last thing he said to me before he hung up on me was, this is a law? How long has it even been a law? And I said, a decade.
Not many youth sports administrators began their careers with the dream of negotiating insurance rates. Most have the love and passion for the game and saw it as a way to inspire the next generation of youth athletes. However, nowadays insurance can be the single greatest cost for a youth sports organization. At American Sports Insurance Services, we've done the work for you and created the single most comprehensive youth sports insurance program on the market. We did it by aggregating the largest youth sports injury database in the world. Let us do the heavy lifting and represent you for all your risk management needs. For more information or to get a quote, visit www.getamsis.com. That's www.getamsis.com.
That's an interesting gap there too. When you talk about these, someone within a specific role who's a specialist, like an attorney, unaware of a state legislation that's been enacted for these types of things. And I think that's where, we see, after the Zach Lightstep law around concussions, we saw sweeping legislation, but it was more of a rubber stamp, and there wasn't any real thought going into how are youth sports different than high school sports, and where do these gaps, exist, and how do we improve upon it? And so I guess, as you look at the broken system, as you put it, and each individual actor in this ecosystem is siloed, what have you uncovered for solutions? I mean, what have you uncovered for, obviously, hopefully it can't all be bad. Where have you seen proactive solutions being effective, where folks are educated and they do create transparent ecosystems with their parents, with their families about what's going on? Have you seen that at all?
Sure. I've seen it in athletic departments, and I've seen it in athletic trainers, obviously, and I've seen it in the foundations of those that have lost. And it's not all bad. And there are lots of people who are trying to make positive steps. And I think that the thing is just like a venue-specific EAP is not the same for every single venue, the changes and the solutions are not one size fits all. They don't work. What works for one doesn't always work for the other. But some of these things, like a venue-specific EAP, is a zero-cost policy. Yet, trying to get them in Ohio, they don't exist. They are not required under state law in Ohio. So that's a deep rabbit hole, because what solutions there are for doctors and the conversations that they should be having with parents, and the conversations that should be being had with athletic directors, and the conversations with parents, they're all different. Those are all completely separate. Like, I had an athletic director tell me that he had to use an AED at his facility for the first time ever this year. And he was so glad that he felt more comfortable after Safer Sidelines had come out, because they had reviewed things. But what he didn't know was when you use the pads that they go bad on an AED. And they didn't have backup pads. Why? Why does he not know that? Well, when has he ever needed to know that? He didn't go to medical school. He's probably signed the purchase order for the AED, but like, it's whose is that to know? Is it the school nurses? So where are those conversations that have never been had? Is it in schools where you need to talk about more, like, hey, you're going into an athletic director kind of role, like, or is it the KHSA, is it the state sport associations that need to say, hey, we're going to beef up our sports medicine conversations, right? And that conversation looks different than a doctor with a parent. Did I answer your question? Sorry.
Well, I think it's interesting. I mean, again, it's, positive examples, looking for places that we see effective solutions, even though they are specific, and then trying to identify some of those common threads. What do we see that is, consistently effective from public awareness, or is it to trainings, those sorts of things that you've come across in all of the lack of success?
Okay. I would say the Matthew Mangine Jr. Foundation is taking intentional steps to take the fear out of being a bystander in a CPR situation by really pushing how to train people in 10 minutes to learn CPR. To say, you don't need a card, even if it's expired, it's okay. You can still perform CPR. And the confidence level at the one high school who has trained every single one of its athletes and coaches, those students are very confident that if they got in a situation where they had to give CPR, they could do it, which is like really neat to hear, because just asking my coworkers sometimes, like, hey, if you needed to give CPR, would you know how? They're like, ugh, like you see that kind of. So I think the Take 10 training that the Matthew and Jean Jr. Foundation has been working, and they've been training trainers. I mean, it led to a success story that I wrote about. An athletic trainer collapsed, and the coaches that he had trained 2 weeks before literally saved his life with hands only CPR while they waited for EMS to get there. So I think that, and I think the push that it's led for AEDs, like across the country that foundations have been pushing for, those are probably some of the bigger solutions. Like there's no stopping these foundations from getting AEDs. It's just having the money to get all of them.
Yeah. And I mean, look, Stephanie, you talk about budget, and especially to me, one thing, when I think of Texas high school football, I think of glorious stadiums that almost beat out college and professional stadiums for, those sports, which to me then goes and says, when these meetings are taking place, there's definitely not someone that's pushing for the idea of, let's not go and spend $100,000 on our brand new football stadium to go seat an extra 20,000 people. Let's go and hire 4 full-time ATs. So one thing that I find when I have these discussions so far on these, podcast episodes is that you get a little frustrated at just the system being so money driven rather than protection driven, because when we think about it, these youth athletes are what bring in the money. If you don't have a team to put out there, you're not going to fill the stadium. So why is it that they haven't realized, you think, that it's about the athlete first, not necessarily about where you're placing the athlete?
I've had this conversation so many times, and the biggest thing that I think I've landed on is that syndrome of like, it's not going to happen here and it's not going to happen to me. That's the most logically illogical answer I think I've landed on, because I just think that they think it happened to that kid or to that school or that town, but not our town.
Yeah. And look, all it takes truly is that, naive thinking to really leave someone so unprepared to when tragedy does strike that it becomes a tragedy rather than something that how to, set yourself up to navigate. Oftentimes you'll see the whole idea of, the topics of things like gun control in the United States. And everyone says, oh, well, it's happening there. It's not happening here. Why would we need to focus on it? It's like, because it happened somewhere else. That's why you need to focus on it. So I think in the future, we obviously all hope that ATs will be more readily available for youth sports. But why do you feel that oftentimes it takes the professional levels making a change for the youth levels to have that repercussion put down onto them? It's okay. I mean, I rarely stump someone like this, but I'll take it.
I think it's kind of the same thing, that they don't think they need it at that level until the professionals have it, right? Like, ooh, the professionals have this. It must be important. But I don't know, because that really hasn't trickled down in the standpoint of like AEDs, medical personnel, cold tubs, all that since Corey Stringer, right? That's the very start of Safer Sidelines.
Yeah.
I also see it as an excuse too, they have all the funding so they can get whatever they want, but we can't do it. So, I mean, at the end of the day, it kind of boils down to a prioritization. And I think it's a larger societal problem because we are by nature in America very reactive to these scenarios. The other piece to this that's very difficult is that, if you're doing something to prevent these incidents from happening, then recording zeros is very difficult. So when you're proactive in your approach, you don't necessarily see the results of that prevention because that's a zero. That's an incident not happening, and that's almost impossible to measure and record. But what I'd like to see is more reporting and more awareness on the incidents, like when we see these life-saving incidents. You know, when we have people who are trained on the sidelines or there is a positive response that does save somebody's life, we really don't hear about those near misses that turn out to be success stories very often because they aren't the tragedies that pull the attention, right? So I guess, you know, being in journalism, I mean, what role do you see media to have in being part of a solution as opposed to continually feeding into this reactive approach towards how we generate law and legislation?
I think you need to cover the saves as much as the losses, which is why I started a save database too. And I'll tell you that it's actually harder to find the saves than it is the deaths because we report on the deaths. And a lot of times the saves, then you have certain laws and certain things, HIPAA or whatever, that goes into effect, or the person doesn't want to talk about it. They don't want their name out there or whatever, privacy laws. And so it gets harder to report on those saves. But I think just journalists as a whole, and I, this is like one of those solution things, right? I will forever be indebted to a small group of athletic trainers who every single time I've called or texted and have asked one of those quote unquote dumb questions have sat there and talked to me and explained to me where I can sit here today confidently and talk about safer sidelines and healthcare for athletes, right? I don't know how many journalists, especially sports journalists, know the health and safety side of it. I didn't get taught it in school. I got taught it by athletic trainers. That's why I say a lot of times Safer Sidelines is not just because of me. It's because of every athletic trainer that has said yes to answering a question that I had. I think there's and I've been saying this for a decade, I think there's a whole part of the sports journalism industry that we're missing, which is the health and safety of those athletes reporting. Like there's very little reporting on it until, like you said, there's an injury or a death. And it's typically like like Christian Eriksen, right? Like it was everywhere then. DeMar, it was everywhere. But why aren't we reporting on it even when it's not, oh my gosh, did you see this massive thing that happened? Why isn't it we're educating to help educate?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it's definitely interesting because when you step away from the fact that it's about, you know, sports reporting and more how news operates and how the media works in today's market is more that you're looking for the title that's going to get, you know, the attention that you deserve for a story. And often people will say, oh, well, yeah, of course, the tragedy stories are what's going to get people's eyes to really focus on it. But there were a lot of times when you see the stories of 9 saved from a burning building, that gets just as much traction. And it's interesting that you brought up the HIPAA side of things where, you know, an athlete may not want to relive that and have it publicized. Do you think that the fact that the athlete may not want to have it publicized is why it looks like there are more, you know, worse off cases than there are success stories?
No. How do I say this? I think that the way we operate as human beings today is not how we did it 5, 10, 15, whatever. Go back any certain amount of time. We crave so much content. The littlest snippet of a song in a TikTok video, the next post that you can scroll to, that journalists have shrunk, the industry has shrunk, and we're just trying to keep up, right? And so the decisions that we have to make sometimes go between telling this lighter story or telling the story that if we don't report it, everybody's going to ask us, why didn't you report on the fact that there was this, you know, football player who died? I don't blame one entity in that. It's exactly like what I said earlier. There's lots of funnels to this, and the solution is not a one size fits all. We all are part of the problem as to why everything has changed and our consumption of everything has changed. And I don't think it's just, kids being worried about it. I don't think most kids even think about it. And I think most people don't even think of the save being a huge story. I just reported one the other day because somebody sent it to me because it was a Facebook post. And so there's so much content out there now that that's huge, right? But even the school it was just a Facebook post. We just do things so differently now, and I don't know if it's right or wrong or it just is. And figuring out what is now and how that looks means there's a huge balance, and I'm a huge responsibility on my part for that, right? Because I'm putting out the content a lot of times to you guys on saying this is what I think is important and what I think you should learn about. Which is why, again, I created that SAVE database. Was okay, I have this database of deaths, but what does saves look like, and who's doing them? Is it bystanders, or is it people who are professionally have been trained again and again and again and have it just an innate response to doing CPR?
Hi, my name is Charlie Wund, and I'm the CEO and founder of the Agency for Student Health Research. When I started the company over a decade ago, I aimed to help reduce injuries within youth sports. Since then, Injure-Free was created as a risk management software platform and has grown to become one of the leading injury reporting platforms used by thousands of athletic organizations and schools nationwide. Our expansive education library and reporting technology provides the tools administrators need to take the pain out of risk management. As a former high school athletic director and youth sports organizer, I understand the regulatory compliance requirements and need for individual accountability. Our goal is to provide a service that does better than checking the box. For more information or to schedule a demo, please visit www.injurefree.com. That's www.injurefree.com.
Would you say, one of the things I think that's unique about your perspective is that a lot of the folks we have on the show here are, have a specialty. They're in a particular realm of, in the medical field, or they're an executive director and something along those lines. But you bring a unique perspective because you've had conversations with all of those different types of folks, parents, athletes, directors, and those types of things. Would you say, that we have an awareness problem to this day? Is it still an issue of we're not privy to how important or the real problems behind youth sports safety? Do you think we're still at that phase of awareness?
Absolutely. Oh, absolutely.
From where we sit, we do this every single day. So when we see this stuff, it's no real surprise, right? We're not shocked anymore. But first time parents going through it, they're supposed to be educated on this stuff. There are now state laws in all 50 states about concussions and about educating parents. So, back to there are laws in place for every single one of these issues: sudden cardiac arrest, heat illness, right? All those things. But we're still not getting to the point of awareness. We're not people who are going into these environments, the high school senior quarterback, their parents haven't been educated to this point, right? So we're still at that point of, who's to know? The lawyers who are supposed to know, the school district officials, right? It's their jobs to know this stuff, and they don't even know. So if we're not going to get the media attention out of the constant stream of content, where do you see those opportunities? How do we just take that first step and make sure that awareness is there and that we have educated populations in these spaces so that we're not relying on the one athletic trainer to cover
Mhm.
2,000 kids in a high school, right? I mean, we got to take that burden away from this one professional in this space because we're losing them, right? And they're burning out, and there's not enough of them to cover the sports anyway. And so we're going in two opposite directions. So how do we get more awareness? How do we get that, at least part of this, taken care of?
I've never seen change get made like an angry parent at a school board meeting.
Which kind of goes back to the reactive approach, right? Somebody's pissed off because their kids or their parents or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, how many sidelines could we walk out to today of youth sports where there are parents sitting there and there's no athletic trainer or no AED? Because I had friends while I was reporting this who I flat out asked, like, does your son have an AED on their sideline? And I got laughs back, like, no, why would he? Like, y'all know what I'm reporting on, right? Like, but one parent in Dallas ISD raised it, y'all. Like, she was mad that there were not athletic trainers on every single sideline. And now gold standard at Dallas ISD is there's at least two athletic trainers. I think at this point, there might even be three, because she said, why are they not all equal? And what are we doing? That's one athletic that the ratio to that is insane. So the change that a parent can make, and I don't think it always has to be reactive. I think it can be proactive. I think it can be a parent feeling empowered by, these are the questions that you can go ask. Like, who is in charge of my child if they go down, and who's staying with the kids? What coach is going with my kid in the ambulance if that were to happen? Like, parents are they're the ones who are going to be the biggest driver in this. Everyone else is so siloed and the solutions for it is so specific. But the one thing that goes across it all is that parent and that parent's child, right? And so, nobody shows up to the school board meeting, and then a bunch of parents show up, and then all of a sudden this person that they don't want as a teacher or an administrator anymore because of this, like, they're gone because a bunch of parents, like, that's what this is. If parents, and that's what we've wondered, like, how do we get this in front of parents? Because athletic trainers know, but they already know this. How do we get this in front of parents? And so we've started actually handing out flyers in pediatrician's office around Louisville. But that's just Louisville. Like, how do I get to your doctor's office, and how do I get to Maryland? Like, how do I do that?
Yeah. What's missing right now? I mean, from the equation of people who you expect, or, industries, or however you want to label that, what's not in, I mean, but they're there, right? I mean,
but they're not. When was the last time you read a healthcare story about a high school athlete?
So just media in general, but we go back to that same problem of there's so much content, so there has to be like double the amount of awareness on this topic, right? I mean, is there, so they're there. I mean, they're part of it. They're ancillary. Could they be doing more? Yes, they could be doing more, right? But then that's kind of this uphill battle, constant flow. So is there a market that you feel, or an industry, or some type of, what's the right word I'm looking for? Like a stakeholder in this ecosystem that you feel is missing, that could maybe push harder than a law, or that angry parent, right? Some type of role in this system that comes in and has a lot of say, or can drive change in some positive way. Have you talked to anybody that you thought maybe should be part of it, and they said, that's just not on our radar, but you feel like they should have been involved?
No, but I will say, if we're saying that parents can drive change, let me back up and say the quickest way to drive change is money. And there are some really big people and really big players and really big organizations that have a lot of money.
Well, we just saw an article this morning. They're investing $4.5 million into VR technology so that athletes can go through VR, and that's supposed to help them from an injury prevention standpoint in some way. I mean, that's the kind of stuff where you look at, wow, $4.5 million. How many AEDs could that buy? You know, how many athletic trainers could we fund in a school system for that, with that kind of money? But were you putting it into VR? You know,
it seems like you're investing more in the future than what the current problem is of the present. And that, again, just seems somewhat frustrating.
Because the current problem of the present is a culture problem. And how do you change a culture? Generationally? Is it going to have to be more generations? Is it going to have to be more high-profile athletes almost dying or actually dying? Did Corey Stringer move the needle so much, and then DeMar Hamlin moved it so much, and is it going to take somebody else to move it even more? Is that what it's going to take? I don't know, but it's definitely a culture problem.
And
so just prioritization then.
Yeah, and even still, it's almost more, and I hate phrasing it like this, but that these injuries are a fad. And when it happens, the coverage is so intense, the message is so clear, the activism by other markets is so prevalent, but then after, a month or so, once it's calmed down, it seems to just leave everyone's, headspace and gets completely forgotten until it occurs again. And then we're reminded this was a problem and we didn't really do enough to actually enact change. So it seems like we just kind of hold on to it and then let it go because something else will come along the way that captures our attention.
Yes, which is why I say journalists needing to do more, because I always have said that typically an athlete's death gets covered in 3 stories. The story that they collapsed, the story of their vigil, and then the story when their cause of death is released. And that third story, that follow-up story of the cause of death, you may or may not get it depending on what else happened in the world and how hard it was to get it from the coroner, because lots of times they're not just going to hand it to you. You have to go get it from them. It's not a problem one project is going to solve, or one podcast episode, or one, right? Like it is a broken system that needs a lot of people to say, I'm going to pick up this piece here and I'm going to pick up this piece here, and we're going to start fixing it because we know how to fix it. It's a perspective issue. It's a reality issue.
No, you're absolutely right. And I mean, look, Charlie, you and I talked to Martin McNair, and, his son Jordan died of heat stroke on the field. And what you're saying is essentially that if things were to get fixed off that one story, Marty wouldn't have needed to start the foundation in his son's name, that the problem would have been fixed. But these foundations that are being created, do you believe that if there are, with unfortunately being the word I'm going to use before it, is that if unfortunately more of these incidents do occur and more foundations are started in the names of these athletes that unfortunately pass, do you think that might start to lead to an identifying by the general public that this is a really big problem that needs to be acted on now?
No, because Rachel Moyer has been doing it for 20 years when Greg collapsed and died, and has been trying to get AEDs in schools. And she called DeMar's high school, and DeMar's high school didn't even have enough AEDs, and they're all in Pennsylvania. What's the count? What's the number? How many kids, how many foundations do you have to have that makes people wake up and realize?
Well, the problem is that, we have the data. I mean, we already know, and we understand what the solutions are. And it's just a focus. It's an awareness and a focus. I mean, if we took the time, going back to the unfunded mandate really becomes one of the bigger problems. And if this was something that, the state or federal government decided to step in and rectify, we could. There could be a process that said, okay, here's the rule and here's where the money's going to come from, and, bingo bango. So, there could be something that could have a more profound impact, but it still stems back to the awareness issue. I mean, until we have educated folks on this space who are, well-rounded. I mean, they understand if you're working in a school system, or quite frankly, if you're running a youth sport organization, which is where there's more of a gap. I mean, 8 million kids out of 40 million participants annually are in high school. So we've got 32 million kids out there who are probably 99% of them aren't even near an AED within a mile.
That's the
And
Wild West. Absolutely, the Wild West.
You know, there's no regulation there. So it comes down to one win at a time when you can work with organizations and begin to work with their administration. But it really is advocacy. I mean, and to your point, Justin, it's unfortunate, but the strongest advocates we have are the parents who remain in these situations and the foundations. But you hate to see it because it is, you know, how many more times does this have to happen? You know, and if this is the only thing that's going to create change, then unfortunate, it's going to be a big number because it is going to take a long time to be in a systemic situation where we can cross the country. So,
yeah. And Charlie, you spoke on data, and I think that that's a really big key. And one of the things, Stephanie, that I love so much about even your website for the Safer Sidelines Project is that while you do have the data and the numbers, you don't just put the number of athletes that have suffered from any, whether it's sudden cardiac arrest, heat illness. You really do focus by giving the photos of these individuals. You make us as a reader and a viewer feel the actual, you know, athletes that they were once there, that they impacted a team, they had teammates, they weren't just another number. And I think that that is one of the most impactful things that you can do is go and show that these kids that are unfortunately passing away from whatever incident they have, that they're not just another number to add to the statistics, that this was a loss of human life that easily could have been prevented if people, like you said, had AEDs, knew how to perform CPR, were aware of certain procedures and protocols. So I think just having that on your website truly is one of the smartest things that I've seen someone do it from a journalistic perspective, especially when it comes to reporting on youth illnesses and deaths.
Thank you. I think that athlete memorial was something the project designer, Kyle, and I intentionally wanted to sit with you. Because if you have an athlete in your life, you've seen them in a jersey, and they look like every other athlete in your life. And they had no idea that it was their last game or their last shot or their last run or whatever. And I really, truly wanted to honor those who can no longer speak for themselves and their families and the hard work that their families have done. And so each one of those has approval behind it from the family member that we shared their son or daughter's photo. And we specifically asked them, please send us one of them in their jersey. Because that's who they were. That's their last photo of them. I mean, the one of Greg Moyer that's in it is literally from the last basketball game that he played. It's minutes before he collapsed, which is just haunting.
Yeah. Well, we appreciate the work you do, Stephanie. I mean, I think that, like I said, from an advocacy standpoint, we need more folks raising awareness, and we'd love to be able to help amplify your work in any way we can as well. We always like to kind of sign off and wind down with questions that are sometimes stumping. We get long dead silence in the air that Justin has to edit out at some point with some of these questions. But we always like to understand from your perspective, if you could just snap your fingers, what's one change that you'd like to see in a positive way, knowing that it would be immediate and overnight without budgets involved? You had that power. What would be that one thing that you felt would make the biggest impact in our world?
An AED on every sideline.
Just one AED on every sideline, done and done.
Yep. That means like one or multiple at a golf course, because I don't know how you define a sideline at a golf course. But yeah, one AED, like how many lives would be saved, not just on the field, but in the stands or of a non-athlete. Yeah. And
Perfect.
because that's the biggest one that people throw at me when I say something. They're like, we don't have that in our budget. I'm like, okay, well then use specific EAP. That's zero cost, right? But
Right.
We're not talking budgets, AED.
Awesome.
That's
Well, we
great,
appreciate
Stephanie.
you.
Yeah,
Thank you so
you
much.
again for giving us some of your time talking about the Safer Sidelines Project. We'll make sure to have it in the description of this, podcast episode so that way all of our listeners can go and view your work. But truly taking the time out of your day to speak on this and continue to raise awareness is just great. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
We would like to thank you all for listening to today's episode of the Safety Goals Podcast, presented by Injury-Free. I'm your host, Justin Torres. To listen to other episodes of the Safety Goals Podcast, check us out on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you listen to your podcasts.